Hey everyone, Derek Johnson with Tatango.com. I'm here with David Carter from the TCPA Defense Force. Right before Thanksgiving here in the United States, we had a rather big announcement from the FCC. So thought it'd be a good time to get on Skype chat here with David and for David to tell you what actually this announcement was and how it affects text message marketing. So David, how you doing?
Hey, good, Derek. How are you?
Good, man. Good. So what is this announcement?
Yeah, so just before Thanksgiving, as you said, the FCC released a public draft of an order where they intend to create a reassigned number database, and that they have decided that they will require all carriers, all communication carriers across the country to report certain information to this database in order to try to address this problem of reassigned numbers that you and I have been talking about now for quite some time. And so just as a way of background for those that are watching, the issue around reassigned numbers popped up more than 3 years ago when the FCC under the former administration said that if you're going to make auto-dialed calls or send text messages, as would be the case for Tatango's clients, to consumers, that you have to have consent from the current subscriber of that phone number. And the issue then arose that oftentimes a consumer might be on one service provider, they may move across the country or just decide to get a different provider. And instead of porting that telephone number, they turn in the phone and the phone number. And then another user, and it could be a couple days or a couple weeks later, gets that phone number. And so if you're sending text messages to a phone number and you don't realize that a new user is there, then that reassigned number could be getting text messages again from a company that thought they had consent to send messages but didn't. And so this has, over time, created a source of litigation for companies where they're sending numbers or sending text messages to reassigned telephone numbers.
Okay. And annoying, for the brand and the consumer, because the brand doesn't want to send text messages to people that didn't opt in, but the brand is really not getting the information that they need from the wireless carriers or the software provider to make the adjustment, to make the update. And a lot of phone numbers right now do get reassigned for many, many different reasons, switching carriers to, going out of country. Like there's a ton of reasons that phone numbers get reassigned. So this is, a rather large issue.
Yeah. And what's really critical about this issue is for the last 3 years, there's been this uncertainty because right now, there are some companies that do their best to try to collect and gather information from the wireless carriers so that they can identify when a number is reassigned and then opt that number out from receiving future messages. But there hasn't been a comprehensive solution that gets all the right data. And indeed, in 2015, when the FCC first imposed this additional burden and say you have to get consent from the current user, in doing that, they acknowledged that there was this big gap in the marketplace about where that data would actually be, you could get the data, and that there wasn't a comprehensive solution that would guarantee that you were protected, right? And so companies have tried to get data from the carriers. And many carriers do provide it, but it hasn't been a comprehensive solution. And then oftentimes, I think, you did some investigation on this issue and sort of realized that sometimes the data that you're getting from the carriers isn't exactly just reassigned numbers. It may be information that also relates to numbers that are being ported and other things, creating a level of confusion in the industry about whether a particular customer should be opted out or whether they should stay on the list just because they're, again, going to a different carrier. So it's safe to say the last 3 years on this issue has been a bit of a mess. And so in that respect, it's good to see the FCC taking a concrete step towards solving a problem that it helped create 3 years ago in a 2015 decision that the FCC released. And so
before we talk about what they released and kind of what this announcement is and how that's going forward, I have heard some people, they talk about it doesn't matter because there's a safe harbor. For text message marketing, explain maybe why they're confused or what they're talking about, and really why a safe harbor for text message marketing doesn't really help text message marketers.
Yes. So in 2015, when the FCC said that you had to have consent from the current subscriber, they also attempted to create at that point what was called a one-call safe harbor. And what that said is that you would have, if you were sending text messages or making calls using an auto dialer, you would have one chance to contact the consumer and realize that that consumer was no longer the person you were trying to reach, and that one call could not be considered a violation of the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, couldn't give rise to liability.
Okay.
But that after that one call, then you would have potential exposure for TCPA violations. And that one call safe harbor is actually resulted in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, a federal court in D.C., deciding that the FCC's entire policy on this issue was irrational and that it needed to be struck down and revisited by the FCC. And that was a decision released earlier this year in March of 2018. And in that decision, the FCC said it was irrational to impose liability on companies sending text messages or making phone calls using auto dialers, and only giving them one chance to have to find out this information if it wasn't practical to get that type of information within a single call. And so it created a situation in which consumers, for example, may get the text message and never respond to say, oh, wait, this isn't the person you're trying to reach. They may not respond to say stopped or quit or opt out. Or if it's a phone call, they may not even answer the phone. And so you wouldn't get any information from them just because you made one attempt to contact this phone number. And so the DC Circuit said this is a pretty irrational policy to impose that level of liability on companies without having a clear way for them to get access to information about when someone has actually had a reassigned number or stopped using the number that was previously registered. And so that ultimately led to the FCC reevaluating this issue. And during the intervening months from March of 2018 to now, the FCC has been seeking a lot of public comment and input on this issue from companies and carriers and everyone else that's interested to try to decide exactly how they would proceed. And so this order from last week is that culmination of a public input process that the FCC has been going through for the past few months, and finally reaching a decision to create and move forward with this database that will help companies ensure that they really do know if the person they are trying to reach is still associated with or connected to that phone number.
Okay, so this really matters for text message marketers, for brands, because the safe harbor thing, well, it sounds like it's safe, it's a safe harbor. It no longer applies. Really, also, it didn't apply that well to text messaging because, people don't answer text messages. They just look at the text message. So this really matters for anybody using text message marketing.
Yeah, absolutely right. So the former safe harbor, it was struck down. It doesn't exist right now. And even when it did exist, it wasn't really a foolproof method of ensuring that you were going to get the information necessary to only contact customers with the right phone numbers now. And so moving forward, the FCC's new database, once it gets up and running, will help companies avoid that potential exposure.
Okay, so where do we stand from, a layman's standpoint? For the last 3 years, there's been a lot of issues about it. People have been submitting comments. I think Tatango has. I know other providers have. So where are we at kind of in the stage? And then when do you, what is the next step and the next step? And then when do you think we'll have a full one database that you can go to and figure out if the phone number is being reassigned?
Yes. So the release of the draft order is an indication that the FCC is at the end of receiving public comment. And as you mentioned, we worked with Tatango to submit comments throughout this process and to help make sure that the FCC was aware of how this issue really impacts companies in real life, in real time, and understanding that often these numbers get reassigned very quickly. And so there isn't necessarily a situation in which the number is laying dormant or not in use for a period that would help to ensure that there was clear information about a reassignment. So we helped to educate the FCC on these issues, and that process of helping to educate them is clearly reflected in the draft order that the FCC just released, that they're scheduled to vote on it in about 2 weeks in early December. They'll have what's called an open meeting at the FCC where they take up big policy agenda items, and this is one of the big policy items they'll be voting on at that meeting. I believe it's on December 14th.
And what are they voting on? I know in the draft order is the very long document, right, that I've received?
Correct.
Okay,
yeah.
We'll link to it somewhere in the show notes or the comments below. That's a long document, and it looks like a bunch of comments. What specifically are they voting on? Are they voting on like, hey, we're going to do it or we're not going to do it, or we agree with the comments, we disagree with the comments?
So technically, the draft order is either has to get voted and accepted by a majority of the commissioners, or if they don't get enough votes, it would get rejected. Typically, the way the FCC operates is they don't release a draft order until the chairman of the commission knows that he has sufficient votes to adopt it. So typically, if the chairman was concerned about whether the item would actually get adopted with enough votes, then they wouldn't release it. They would continue to try to make edits or changes until they felt like they had sufficient support for it. Here we know that there's 3 Republican commissioners. Currently, there's only 1 Democratic commissioner, and there's an empty seat. So we know in practice that they should get at least the 3 votes of the 3 Republican commissioners led by Chairman Pai to support the adoption of this order. And the order is lengthy, but that's how the FCC adopts policy, right? It gets boiled down into some language that goes into the Code of Federal Regulations, but really the details behind what they mean are these very lengthy orders, like this particular order that really walks through the issues, the positions of various parties on the issues, and then ultimately the conclusions that the commission is reaching on this particular matter. And so that's what they'll be voting on. And it really is an up or down type vote. And then some of the commissioners will offer different comments or make statements about the issue and why it's important to them.
Okay, so they vote on, this is December-ish, and they're voting essentially to say yay or nay on creating this database. Then there's a bunch of details about how it's created, who manages it, all those types of things.
Correct.
Let's hypothetically say, 3 out of 4, whatever, say yay, and we're going forward. How long do you think this will take until companies like Tatango, brands, have access to this information so they're no longer sending text messages to reassigned phone numbers?
Sure. So there's going to be, in this situation, at least a year of delay and probably a little bit longer than that before the database becomes active and you will have access to it. The issue here is that the database has to be created, and so they have to find a company. The FCC itself will not run the database on a day-to-day basis. They will have a contract with an external party that will create the database and have to follow certain technical requirements in creating the database. So it's going to probably take at least a year for all those details to be worked out, for the company to be selected. And then, it's possible that within that year, the company is able to start building the database, but it may not be fully up and running. And if history has anything to teach us, these processes often take longer than people originally suspect when they're starting it. Now, in this particular circumstances, the FCC has purposefully made the database relatively easy in terms of the minimum amount of data going into the database and sort of a couple of ways to search or get information out of the database, but really trying to keep it from becoming overloaded with a lot of unnecessary information. So that could help to accelerate the process a bit. But you're probably looking at least a year before the database is ready for data to be put into it. And then there, of course, has to be a process where the carriers start providing that data. And so one of the things the FCC did in this order is start the process of imposing obligations on carriers to gather and store the right information so that when the database is ready, it can get populated with all this information about the numbers that have been reassigned. So they have to both create the database and then also get the mechanisms in place for the carriers to get the data into the database. So my hunch is like in practice, you're talking about 18 months to 2 years before the database is really up and running and functioning for companies like Tatango to use.
And some people may not realize that in the United States, and this only applies to the United States, correct?
That's right, yeah.
Okay. In the United States, it's not just Verizon, T-Mobile, AT&T, Sprint. There's 30, 40 other wireless carriers out there, many that you've never heard of, you'll never hear of.
Right.
That's why this is such a big undertaking. It's not just the big four, big five, submitting this data. It's also the small 30, 40 that also have to do the exact same thing that the big 4 or 5 are doing and do it the same way and put it in the same format. So it seems easy, but when you look at the full kind of breadth of the problem and who's involved, I think it will be a big undertaking.
Yeah, and you're not actually even capturing the whole universe there, Derek, because this database is not going to be limited to wireless carriers. It will also include landline phone numbers, as well as voice over IP type newer providers that may utilize networks of different carriers to provide their service, but have this voice over IP service, which could easily, you're talking then about a couple hundred carriers that might have, that could be captured by this requirement to submit data. And one of the things that the FCC has said is that they will grant a 6-month extension for smaller carriers, particularly carriers in the rural areas that may not be able to kind of get this process in place quite as quickly as the bigger carriers would, but that even those really small carriers and for example, I do a lot of work in rural locations like Iowa and South Dakota, and in Iowa there's more than 100 carriers that exist just in that one state. So if all of those companies have to comply with these requirements, you're talking about quite a bit of work to get all those pieces coordinated and make sure that they're all aware of these obligations.
Yeah, so it does seem like a big undertaking. Now, let's say it's going to be 2 years. Again, things change. But what can text message marketers right now do? Because the data is not readily available, there's a lot of mixed opinions on whether the data is accurate, what the data represents, the stuff that is currently being sent from the wireless carriers. Right. From a text message marketing standpoint, if you're a brand, the one thing I've heard is always, or at least frequently, put in your message text stop to end or text stop to opt out. And the reason being is if for some reason you do get a reassigned phone number or a phone number on your list gets reassigned, at least you have the instructions in there to have the new consumer opt out so they don't get frustrated enough to kind of take the legal route, of opting out rather than just opting themselves out. Are there any other tactics that you think would be good kind of in this limbo stage for brands to make sure that, if they are text messaging reassigned phone numbers, at least they're making it easy for the consumer to opt out?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple points there that I would hit. So the first is that even though there is not currently a comprehensive database that captures all of the reassigned number issues, there are databases that do exist where companies are making a good effort to get the data that they can. And so, working with and looking at companies like DNC.com, and there's a solution through Newstar and some other providers that you can look at, and at least that would take care of a big portion of the issue. So I do think that that's a kind of first line of defense for companies on this particular problem. The second is, as you mentioned, of course, you want to continue to remind people of how to get off the list, make it easy for them to do that. And that's going to take care of the vast majority of the other people, right, that are not really interested in trying to pursue litigation. They just want to stop receiving messages with their new phone. And so most people, if you make it easy and clear to them, will simply engage in that process, and that'll be the end of it, as long as you comply with those opt-out requests. And then I think the third thing that you can do, which may not have sort of the practical result of not sending messages to reassign numbers, but could potentially help you at some point in time in the future if you're involved in cases or litigation, is review your terms and conditions with the customers when they opt in, and make sure those terms and conditions include a requirement for the consumer to notify you when they no longer are associated with that phone number, right? So at least put the burden on the consumer to provide you with notice if they're going to stop using that phone number. That at least helps if there's ever allegations or arguments that you intentionally violated the TCPA or did things like that. You can point back to your terms and conditions and say, well, look, in this, I did everything I reasonably could to not send messages to people. And here in this instance, the consumer failed to complete the requirement of notifying me that they weren't going to use the number. It's not going to be 100% foolproof arguments there, but it's at least something you can do affirmatively to try to address this issue. And I think
it almost seems like a combination of things, but nothing is a get out of jail free card or a safe harbor. It's more of, hey, showing, a judge, or, plaintiff's attorney saying, hey, we have, 2-3 things that we're doing right now to, make sure that this doesn't happen, because as a brand, we don't want this to happen.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you want to show or be able to show that you're taking all these reasonable precautions. It's really the maximum you can do at this time, and then wait and see how the FCC resolves some of these other issues, because they are currently reconsidering this question of whose consent is needed. Is it the current subscriber? Is it the person you intended to reach? So until that question is resolved, because that was also struck down and sent back to the FCC for further consideration, then at least when you're in this, continue to exist in this gray zone, you have some decent arguments that you've done everything reasonable and practical as a company. And I do think that again, not 100% guarantee, but certainly I think a lot of judges are going to look at that and say, should I really impose liability in these circumstances, and hopefully come to the reasonable conclusion that would be unfair. So
now I know, I don't know, it was a couple months ago, a year ago, the FCC was asking for opinions in Tatango, and we submitted, lengthy opinions on what we thought about this issue, why it was impacting brands and text message providers. Is there anything right now that brands or text message providers, maybe they missed the boat on, their kind of original filing, that they should be doing? Or is it kind of just, it's now out of our hands and we just got to wait till the vote?
Yeah, so in this reassigned number issue in particular, it's sort of the ship has sailed, so to speak, right? The FCC has already reached their conclusions. There are other issues that the FCC is continuing to deliberate on, and those other issues include this question of whose consent is the right consent, as well as questions about how broadly the key terminology of an automatic telephone dialing system, which is a whole nother issue, how broadly that terminology should be defined when applying the Telephone Consumer Protection Act. So those, and if there's a handful of issues that the FCC is still wrestling with right now, and if companies wanted to weigh in on those issues, they could still do so through filing written comments, or even taking time to set up meetings and talk directly with FCC staff members that work on these issues at the FCC. So there are still ways to engage in the process, but not the reassigned numbering issue. Is the decision has been made, and unless you participated in the process and have some significant problem with the direction the FCC has taken, then your avenues to have involvement in the issue is pretty much at a close right now.
It was pretty cool to see, we submitted comments, on behalf of Tatango. It seems like the FCC read the comments and they actually integrated a lot of our comments into their, I guess, ruling, or not ruling. What is it?
Order. Yeah.
Order. So usually it feels like with government, you state your opinion and I bet it gets filed away somewhere and never looked at. Right. It seems like, they went through a lot of different comments from a lot of different brands, text message providers, VoIP providers, and a lot of those comments are actually in the order. So it's not something I think brands can just sit, back, for future things and say, well, they won't even care about my opinion. At least from the document that I saw, it looks like they really care about, all the opinions, and it helps them craft really a better solution for the entire industry.
Yeah, absolutely, Derek. And I think that in particular, they don't.
Oh, we might have lost you for a second. You want to repeat that?
Yeah, so I was saying absolutely that I think it's important for companies to participate in the process, and that in particular, I think the comments submitted by Tatango did have a real measurable impact on the solutions that the FCC created in this particular order. For example, Tatango, having done a lot of groundwork, you in particular having done a lot of groundwork on this issue, was able to help inform the FCC about the fact that oftentimes carriers are reassigning numbers very quickly, and so they're assigned to a new user within a period of 2 days or a week or so, and that has helped to fuel this problem of reassigned numbers not getting off the right list and not being identified as a reassigned number. And so as a result of those comments that we filed on Tatango's behalf, the FCC has now for the first time imposed a mandatory waiting period of 45 days for that carriers will have to let numbers sit on the sideline for 45 days before a new user can have that number assigned. I think that change alone will help to make a significant dent in the number of consumers receiving unwanted text messages, because that 45-day window, though there should be a sort of bounce back message coming from the carriers that will identify that this is not an active number right now and will help to eliminate some of those future text messages. So I do think that, Tatango approach this issue from the perspective that both consumers and brands want to communicate together at the right times, and that it doesn't help consumers or brands to send out a bunch of unwanted messages. And as a result of that, Tatango's comments were, I think, very insightful and useful to the FCC in getting to some common sense solutions on this issue that has plagued both sides of the equation for a long time. So I definitely encourage other companies in the ecosystem to continue to be a voice of reason on these issues and to help the FCC reach better outcomes. And the more you participate, the more likely that is to be the case.
No, that's great. So as we wrap this up, anything else to know? I know on your blog, you guys have a great blog. You're obviously on top of this. You'll let us know and let everybody know when the vote happens and what the vote is, and then the impact from that. Anything else people should know?
Yeah, so I do think there's one other point that we want to continue to pay attention to on this issue. So in this order, the FCC will authorize the creation of the database and will mandate that carriers provide reassigned number information to the database. What the FCC does not do in this order is then provide for a safe harbor, which we talked about, for companies that use the database to scrub against and eliminate reassigned numbers from their lists. That is an issue that the FCC leaves open for future consideration. And I think that's probably just as a practical matter because they know it's going to take a while for the database to get up and running, so they don't have to resolve that issue today. But I do think in the future we will see an opportunity to weigh in again on this question of whether there should be a safe harbor created once the database is up and running and companies are using it. Should they have protection in case a carrier doesn't submit the right information to the database or something like that? I think that is will be another opportunity in the future and something to keep an eye on. But for right now, what we're expecting is the database will be created. Companies will be encouraged to use it, but not necessarily required to use it. and there won't necessarily be a clear protection just for using the database. So I think that's going to be another opportunity for companies, again, to step up and encourage the FCC to close the final chapter on this and make sure that if you use the database that you're protected for doing so. So there will be,
and that would be the stance most likely of text message providers and brands is, hey, if we're using the database, and using it properly, the brand, the text message provider, they should be safe from, if the database is incorrect, or something goes wrong at the database level.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
So I do think that that's an issue that will resurface again as we get closer to actually having a functioning database, and that companies in this space should be keeping an eye on as well.
Okay. Well, that's why we have you. You'll keep us updated. Anything else anybody should know?
I think that's at a high level, that's it. I think if you're going to link to the long order, if anyone's really interested in the topic, they can kind of read through it. And as you said, we have some additional information on our blog. But hopefully that gives those that are watching this a good sense of the direction we're headed and how this can be beneficial ultimately for both companies and consumers to make sure that we get messages to those people that want them.
And what's the URL of your website?
It's TCPA defenseforce.com, and then if you go there, you'll see our blog link up in the top corner there. Pretty easy to find it.
Perfect. And we'll drop a link below here to the order, to your information, the website, so they can contact you guys. And if anybody else has any questions, be sure to drop a comment below. Both David and I are active in the comments, so we'll do our best to answer them. Again, David, thank you very much for your time today and explaining this order. And essentially, this could have a huge impact for text message marketing and brands. So definitely something, even though nothing is going to impact it, tomorrow, the next day, even maybe the next year, with the rollout of this, if, the vote goes yes, this could have a huge impact. So I think brands just need to be aware of what's going on.
Absolutely.
That sounds
great.
great.
Good to talk to you. Thanks
Sounds
so much.
good, David. Talk soon, everybody.